the two kind of aspects that we're going to look into today's presentation. And in particular, I'm going to really look into starting with an understanding of where does this need for data-enabled innovation and flexibility around the ways in which we work come, to jump onto information security and how information security interacts with all of that, then to go back into the need for data-enabled innovation and flexibility to conclude my my presentation. Now, as I was saying, I kind of come from a bit of a strange background. Naturally, I'm a very optimistic person. I'm really kind of, I like to think about innovation. I like to think about taking risks and looking at how we can do things better in terms of the products we build and sell, the services we offer, the experiences we give to our customers. So I'm actually a natural optimist that is actually a little bit pessimist by training, because as John was mentioning, I started working, my first job was in the Italian police force, and then I was a security manager, and I developed quite a bit of industry experience in risk management and security, which, as you can understand, is probably not the most innovation and also data, I would say, driven type of industries and environments. And then across my career, I worked also at QUT here in Brisbane, and I was actually part of a research and kind of consulting type of team, working on understanding how can we better shape user-centric services for customers. And we were actually working with some major client organizations in this capacity. And that's where I picked up my design thinking type of approach. And that's where I, if you want, started going back into being very optimistic about innovation in the world. And then fast forward a couple of years, I joined the UQ in March 2020 coming from the UK. So I came back to Australia because I was, as I said before, I was here before. I did my PhD here. By the way, my PhD was in safety and security management systems in international airports. So another very strong risk management focus. And to this day, I'm really actually balancing between the two, right? So my really research focus and discipline area is cybersecurity. But as I picked up design-led methods and design thinking as a practitioner, I would say, I also love to keep that up and running. And lately, I try to actually start working on merging the two components together. So working on cybersecurity and information security in general by adopting a user-centric approach and a design-led approach, which is something I'm going to mention at the end of my presentation. So this is just to give you a bit of an overview why I do care about innovation-driven organizations, but also information security and where this potential trade-off could stand. Now, as we all know, we keep talking about the fact that companies need to innovate, right? You are data managers, I assume, in your organizations. So obviously, you probably have your CEOs or board members constantly knocking at your door and kind of asking you, what can we do with the data we have? How can we create better client-facing services or products, and so on and so forth. And obviously, research supports that. It's not just, it's just the idea of innovating for the sake of innovating, but it's also the idea that, well, there's something called the red queen effect, very strong these days, whereby companies need to keep innovating to just be able to keep their market positioning or stay where they are. Okay, and for instance, in this piece of research by InnoSide, it shows the change in duration, in tenure, in the Standard & Poor's 500 ranking by companies, and now this has changed across the last decades. So from 30 to 35 years of average tenure of Standard & Poor's 500 companies in the late 70s to something that is going to shrink in this decade to 15 to 20 years. So that tells us that companies obviously need to innovate to be able to stay on top of the competition constantly and constantly. Now, we do have a lot of kind of different ways and approaches onto how we innovate. I'm not going to spend too long on this because I'm pretty sure you're familiar with most of them. The next couple of slides are really my attempt to show you from a business perspective how being able to manage your data and kind of fruitfully make usage of data translates into innovation and better market positions. If you've never heard of this book, Platform Revolution, if you've never read it, I strongly suggest you to take a look, because it's actually it's a little bit dated at the moment, but it's actually quite a good book in terms of understanding how successful companies these days have managed to change their business model and the ways in which they do business to stay ahead of their competition. And in this book, the authors talk about the concept of co-opetition, which is collaborating with your competitors. And if you look at these 4 key characteristics of how co-opetition works, you can clearly understand the importance of managing data. Customers and suppliers become value-creating partners, and I'm pretty sure that this to you speaks about sharing information with your customers and suppliers, sharing data, setting up contractual arrangements whereby there's a bit of an osmotic process between the data that you collect and your customers and suppliers have or collect to create better value and become really value-creating partners. Then the focus obviously shifts from protecting value within the firm, which is the traditional way of competing of companies. Imagine the traditional concepts of competitive advantage and keeping the pie the same size, just trying to get a bigger slice, into creating value outside the firm. Think of companies such as Airbnb or Facebook, just to name a couple, and think of how they were capable of creating networks outside there even before starting selling products to those networks. Again, this is a concept that clearly speaks about the ability of collecting the right data and translating the right data into valuable information. Focus on opportunity over ownership. Think of the concept of everything as a service. On persuasion over dictation, and this is particularly relevant vis-a-vis clients and customers. And last but not least, the important thing is not really owning assets, but having access to customer-producer networks and the related interactions that are created. And again, I was speaking about networks before and network effects, and how companies such as, for instance, again, Facebook and Airbnb, but we can think of YouTube, for example, were kind of masters and are actually masters in building those customer-producer networks by extrapolating the right amount of data. So one way of innovating, collaborating with your competitors. Agility, it's another very, very relevant, and actually it's another one in which data take the lion's share in terms of the importance of being able to create the right amount of value, and also designing in flexibility in the organizational processes. McKinsey has kind of identified 5 trademarks of agile organizations. So those organizations that maintain flat structures, very clear accountability lines, hands-on governance, whereby every employee is really across the production life cycle of the whole company. Every employee kind of embraces the strategy of the company and manages to kind of help the company implement that strategy. And I believe in 3 of these trademarks, in particular along structure, processes, and technology, data is absolutely fundamental. Look at, for instance, in structure, on networking and powered teams within the organization, the concept of having open physical and virtual environments. And think of the capacity for these companies to build almost a seamless connection between the collected data in the field and the organizational databases that then get translated into relevant information, design better services or products for the clients. Same thing along the organizational processes, and obviously same thing along the lines of technology. Okay, obviously companies in this space, agile companies, are masters in managing enabling technologies and kind of putting in place concepts such as evolving technology architectures, evolving systems, evolving tools. Imagine, for instance, the impact that the Internet of Things has on the capacity of organizations to collect data and again, build delightful services and products for their clients, oftentimes be able to anticipate the client's needs by understanding what is, for instance, the usage of a specific service by a client, and how can I anticipate and better provide my service along the lines of that usage. For instance, imagine the concept of smart fridges that allow you to have products that are scarce in your fridge being directly ordered to the supermarket and then delivered at your door. Okay, so another significant way of innovating that is certainly data-driven is agility, and another one is the concept of consumerization of IT. Okay, now when I talk about consumerization of IT, I'm really meaning the concept of bring your own device. That, as you know, has actually created stronger flexibility for employees in the ways in which they seamlessly jump from their own personal devices into their corporate devices, and they kind of realize efficiencies and also this kind of seamless process helps them share data with components in the organization with kind of oftentimes faster turnaround. Okay, and obviously not every organization has reacted in the same way in the concept of to the concept of consumerization of IT. Some companies have actually put in place a little bit of resistance because, as you can understand, coming from a traditional corporate world where all pieces of IT had to be stamped by the IT department, for instance, in an organization, into a world where employees can bring their own laptop and can bring their own mobile device and actually do work on their mobile device, and oftentimes store data, organizational data on their mobile device, giving them, again, flexibility and ability to kind of reach out to the customers, oftentimes faster and with kind of better capability to design customized experiences for those customers. Obviously, from an organizational perspective, the consumerization of IT, so bring your own device, has brought a rethinking of procurement processes, of how the company and the management and the supervisory role think of the organizational strategies, new organizational policies. Some companies have actually prevented employees from using their own devices in the workplace or connecting with their own devices to the corporate network. Obviously, that was actually a bit of a first reaction of resistance, the concept of defend, and the idea that all the business things are certainly better than the consumer's things, and they should only be used, only the business things and the business IT devices should be used, which is a concept that, as we know, doesn't really hold true anymore as much. To a second reaction, which is more an understanding, and this is probably where most companies sit at the moment, and then this is kind of characterized by this osmotic process of integrating consumer and business IT and allowing end users and employees in general use both ways. To a third step, which not every company, I believe, has actually embraced, which is the embraced step, whereby enterprises actually are more and more dependent on BYOD concepts to do their business. And think, for instance, also on the usage of third-party APIs that get pushed onto our own personal consumer devices that we do use at the workplace. Obviously, probably most of you have already started thinking about the potential security issues that are associated with the consumerization of IT, which is great, but it's something that for the moment, I'm just going to park there. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about other ways of innovating. Now, another trend that I'm sure you are aware of, and you probably have seen in your organizations, which is a trend that really refers to the evolution of IT departments in our companies. is the kind of moving away from the concept of traditional IT into the concept of transformational IT. And obviously, speaking and preaching to the converted as data managers and experts in data management, obviously you do have daily pressures on understanding of data and IT as kind of the source of data, not just as something that serves to enable organizational processes, but something that can actually transform the strategy of the organization. It's a little bit the same as the shift that we're seeing in some companies from a traditional CIO position into more kind of innovative type of positions, such as, for instance, CDOs, chief digital officers, and in general, a transformational type of approach to what data and IT can do for organization. Obviously, as you can understand, the focus moves from just looking at the technical part of the piece of IT into looking at the application side of things. So having a focus from technology into a more business holistic type of approach. Obviously, IT is not just a support type of component of the organization, becomes absolutely strategic. The function becomes strategic from being previously operational. The structure of the organization obviously has to change, and you're absolutely certainly aware of this as you saw these dynamics in the last couple of decades, from structures that are very organizational departments that are very siloed, where communication and information sharing is not as easy as we could imagine, into a more integrated organizational structure where really the glue and the blood within the system is really data, okay, and so on and so forth. So I'm sure you're familiar with these dynamics, so I'm not going to stay too long on this. Again, moving from a focus on IT, I don't know if you're familiar with a brilliant article that came out a couple of years ago, IT doesn't matter, as in it doesn't matter, but using the concept of IT doesn't matter, into a more transformational role for IT and data that comes with it. Now, all of this obviously refers the glue and really the blood of all of this is the concept of data, as we know. Okay, and another thing that I would like to kind of point out is that obviously innovation can be data driven. But what is really important, and again, you as interpreters of data in your organization, what is really important is applying the right analysis tool, the right meaning to the data sets that we collect, and the right interpretation to the data sets that we collect, so that we can build information from data. Okay, in a famous article that came out not long ago, about big data, the authors actually were quite emphasizing quite a lot the fact that what really matters in the big data revolution is the information that is extracted, not obviously just the data by itself. And then for organizations that have managed to develop a little bit more of a sophisticated understanding of how data and information works, once you have your information, which is pretty much a more refined product than raw data, with further analysis, with personal experiences, and this is where probably also employees' human capital and background and gut feelings and ability to analyze information, that leads to knowledge. Okay, and as you can understand, the push that modern organizations have into devising better services, processes, and products for the end users out there really follows this kind of process, this magic triad, okay? From data to information to knowledge. Customer data about themselves don't really tell us much about our customers. It's the information that we build on those data, and even better, the knowledge that we build from that information that help us design better services, processes, and products for our customer. Okay, so the focus on end user centricity and understanding and knowing your customers really goes down this triadic process. Okay, now we spoke a lot about, and this is where I'm shifting into what as information security to do with all of this. The focus and the push on companies to be really game changers and implement data-driven technologies to better understand internal processes and finally to better serve the customers out there also has been accompanied by similar pushes in the other direction. If you look at, for instance, this slide, it's an article from 2017 from the Harvard Business Review. It actually shows what on the left-hand side, what are considered the most important technologies for organizations to be implemented. And as you can see, 75% of people that were interviewed said that big data and data analytics are absolutely crucial for their organizations to kind of push into their business plan for the next 3 to 5 or whatever years, okay? But at the same time, in the same survey, they also asked, well, what do you think your customers think about what you're doing as an organization? And 68% of people said, well, our customers are increasingly concerned about how well the security and privacy of their data is maintained. Okay? So you do have organizations sitting between a bit of a rock and a hard place. From a competition and business perspective, the message is clear. You know, you need to go down the track of, you know, deploying as many data-driven technologies as you can, because that allows you to better know your customers and better serve them. But on the other hand, they have a kind of similar push just in the other direction from the customer say, yes, but we are concerned about how you are managing our data and how secure our data within your organizational boundaries are. Okay? So this is really the turning point, and this is where the dilemma and the trade-off between data-driven innovation and information security comes into place. Now, traditionally speaking, and this is where I kind of work more on the information security side of things, traditionally speaking, the magic triad, data, information, knowledge, is tackled by information security, focusing almost exclusively on data and information. If you look at the one of the mostly widespread definitions of information security, it says that information security is protection of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data / information, mainly information, but data as well, within an organization. And there's actually not much mention of the protection of knowledge, which, as we discussed before, it's really what drives innovation to the utmost level for companies out there. So there's already a little bit of a gap there in terms of our capacity as organizations to protect what we need to protect. And if you look at also the 3 concepts of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, they speak a lot to privacy of information, to capacity of organizations to maintain data similar across time without having anybody playing up with the data, and also the availability of data. So, you know, collecting data that then doesn't just magically disappear somewhere, but is kind of top of mind for the organization, and the organizational employees and leaders know actually where to get it, okay? And again, this really speaks to this trade-off between pushing towards innovation and then having to maintain and sharing data, for instance, and then having to maintain information security. Now, all of this conversation, as you kind of guessed, really speaks a lot about companies being able, as I said, to make their suppliers and their customers that those trusted partners, and creating those connections that create superior value for the end users. Unfortunately, there's actually several eminent cases out there in which this trade-off didn't really play up very well. And just to give you an example, obviously this is all publicly available information, so nothing mysterious around it. One not too recent but still quite relevant case, the target data breach. I don't know if you're familiar with this data breach, but it's actually a very stereotypical case in understanding that oftentimes the trade-off between pushing innovation and sharing data can actually lead to unintended consequences. So back in 2013, Target was actually doing quite well in terms of information security. They were compliant to PCI DSS. They installed some new malware detection tools, FireEye, that back then was actually quite advanced. And we actually also started partially segmenting their network through virtual local area network. Right? So to prevent escalation of potential breaches, that was actually a good step. And then between the end of 13 and the beginning of 14, this data breach happens. And the consequences of the data breaches were 40 million of credit card numbers lost, 70 million of personal records lost. The CEO had to resign. A new CIO was appointed. From a customer's trust perspective, things changed dramatically. In January 2013, this is Target America, so we target US. 43% of households declared that they would shop at Target. 1 year later, that number dropped to 33%. Overall, 291 million spent to recover from that data breach. Okay. Now, what's interesting in this case, and that speaks to the idea of bringing suppliers and networks of customers within the organizational boundaries, is how the breach unfolded. Now, I'm not going to stay too long on the different details. September is when attackers attack. Now, this is a typical example of a third-party attack where the attackers actually didn't compromise the target network directly, but they compromised a supplier of Target, which is Fazio Mechanical Services, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning provider for Target's shops around the US. Obviously, they managed to penetrate the Fazio network, and they figured out that they could actually access the Target network through Fazio. So they did that. They actually attacked the POS terminals at Target, and there were actually also some issues with how the data were collected at the POS level. Data were collected and stored for a short amount of time unencrypted. So obviously, quite easily attackable. Then, just very quickly on the timeline, November is where the attack unfolded. They began collecting credit card data. They installed malware at the POS level, as I said. They started collecting this data, started exfiltrating the data. Obviously, the purpose there was collecting credit card information to then sell them on the dark web. Target didn't really notice anything, despite the fact that there were some warnings popping up. In December 12 of December 2013, the Department of Justice notified Target that something is wrong. In December 15, they removed most malware. In January 10, they said, well, unfortunately, there was some data breaches and there was some actually personal information, PII, that leaked out there. Now, the technical aspects of the attack is something I'm not going to stay really too long on. The attackers got through Fazio through a Trojan attack. It was actually quite a sophisticated piece of technology that they utilized because it has some detection avoidance and memory scrapping capabilities. So it actually attacked the POS and managed to steal the unencrypted card details at the POS level and then pushed it out. Okay. The important thing and what is really interesting here, and is the question that all analysts ask themselves, how was it possible for these attackers to penetrate Target through supplier of heating, ventilation, and air conditioning? And obviously, there's a couple of references here if you're interested in doing a little bit more reading about this. There were, it seems that Fazio had access to parts of the network of of target, probably we can assume because there were some information sharing arrangements in place whereby either that did go unnoticed and it was possible, or somebody within the organization decided to set up the network and allow Fazio to access parts of the target network. It doesn't really matter what happened. What is really important here is to understand that, you know, from an information security perspective, supply chain management becomes an essential element to take into account, especially as it happens these days, when the digital footprint of our organizations is expanding to incorporate into the organizational boundaries more and more external parties. Okay. Obviously, when we talk about data sharing, there's different potential traps out there from an information security perspective. Basically speaking, you know, we can think about data sharing outside the organizational boundaries, and obviously you're going to have two types of risks there: cybersecurity and information security risks. And when I talk about cyber and information security, I use them as synonyms. They're really not synonyms. One is more on the digital side of things. The other, it's more on all type of information side of things, including physical issues. And there's also obviously privacy issues, okay? Because, you know, sharing data with organizations out there to create better services for customers can actually hamper the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data, such as, for instance, personal identifiable information. Obviously, it depends on the events and the risks that are associated with these. Also depend on the type of industries we are working. Okay, think, for instance, data sharing arrangements between organizations in the healthcare sector, or I don't know, data sharing arrangements between organizations within food and beverage, for instance. Okay, still privacy concerns in both cases, but potentially with different magnitude. Okay, then obviously we're going to start thinking about what type of informed consent did we administer our customers, for instance, if data sharing is around customers' data, we have in place. What organizational policies do we have in place to share this data? And obviously, if we are a multinational company, that obviously applies in different ways based on the jurisdictions or the legislations we are operating in. Think, for instance, GDPR over in Europe, notifiable data breaches scheme here in Australia, and obviously, you know, inter-organizational sharing arrangements can actually make outside legislation relevant to our own country. Think, for instance, of the application of GDPR to Australian companies that do business with customers over in Europe. From a cybersecurity perspective, obviously, it kind of, these data sharing arrangements require companies to look at what is the type of security architecture they have in place. Do we outsource or insource our security services? What are the governance structures in place? What is the strength of our defenses in case we are subject to an attack? What are the contractual arrangements that we have with our partner organizations, our suppliers, and so on and so forth? And you know, when I speak to security specialists in organizations, in particular people that work in governance, risk, and compliance, there's more and more a conversation around part of it is actually contract management and being able to build contracts that, in case something goes wrong, kind of, you know, free you from responsibility for what's possible. Cyber insurance obviously being a big component of that as well. And again, what is the legislation and how the legislation impacts what we do in terms of how we share or not share data with our partners. And obviously, from a cybersecurity perspective, there's always going to be the attacker's role, okay? Which is something that I'm not really covering too much because to a certain extent, it's really independent. You know, there's this concept in cybersecurity whereby if they want to attack you and they really want to get their hands on your data, you know, there's a chance they might be able to do it. So there's also in the equation, we also need to consider the willingness and the capacity of the attackers and so on and so forth. But as I said, most of it is really outside our control. So probably something that is we can't really focus too much now. And then there's also the data sharing arrangements that happen within the organizational boundaries. Okay, and oftentimes if we take the stance of our end users, being that citizens or clients or customers in general, they come from the perspective that organizational departments within the same organization have to share data. Okay. But they don't understand it. Oftentimes it's not as easy. I think, for instance, especially in the public sector, between departments that work under the same organization, oftentimes for the sensitivity of data that could be shared, those sharing agreements are not really that possible. Okay, and obviously from a user experience perspective, this is where citizens go, oh my goodness, why do I have to keep entering this same information in these forms when I'm dealing with the public sector, when I'm dealing, for instance, with Queensland government, okay? Not understanding that it's not always as easy to share data within organizations. Obviously, privacy considerations, when it's within organizational boundaries, have a totally different kind of consideration from what happens outside the organizational boundaries. Obviously, there's still going to be consideration about, are we sharing PII or are we sharing something that is not PII? What happens to the data after we store the data? Are we keeping the data forever when there's no need to do so? Or, as we should, are we disposing of data that we don't need anymore? The concepts of right to be forgotten, and again, organizational policies built around it. And similar to what happens with sharing data outside the organizational boundaries, obviously, having the right cyber defenses in place, considering from a human factors perspective, if your employees are doing the right things, or if they're just building potential backdoors or vulnerability along the perimeter for external attackers to get in and put their hands on that data. Okay, so this is a bit of an overview of the kind of information security implications that we can isolate and identify from a data sharing perspective and in data sharing. And then the environment throws into the mix some unexpected events. And obviously, we all think of COVID-19. Okay, how does that affect the security of information and data sharing arrangements for organizations? Well, first of all, companies massively go into remote work. Okay, and remote work reshapes the organizational boundaries, because all of a sudden employees have to work from home. Okay, so they're not physically in the workplace anymore, and even from a network perspective, they're accessing systems through gates that are actually not organizational gates, because they're doing that from home. Okay, so how does that change in terms of the security of our data and information sharing arrangements? And obviously, even when COVID-19 dies down a little bit, companies have to make a decision. Are we going to allow people to go back to the organization and work from the office, or are we okay with allowing them work from home? So the concept of business as usual itself becomes a little bit more fuzzy and difficult to define. And then three main kind of, I would say, dynamics that impact the security of data sharing arrangements when you work from home. There's a massive deployment of new technologies and devices. Think, for instance, Zoom. Okay, and also think of the repercussions from a security perspective that the massive adoption of tools such as Zoom has had in the past. I remember, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, some companies prohibited their employees to use Zoom because apparently there were some security issues. Now, those security issues apparently have been tackled by Zoom, but obviously from a business perspective, that's a big decision to make. Obviously, this massive deployment of new technologies required having shorter risk analysis processes. Right? So imagine that if from one day to the other, you have to have at least, I don't know, 80% of your employees work from home, and you need to, as an IT department, for instance, to give them the capability to do so. How are you gonna assess the risks associated with those new technologies and the usage of those technologies from remote when you have, I don't know, operations department knocking on the door and saying, hey, you need to enable people to work, otherwise we cannot run our business. Right? And together with that, new training requirements, because as we're going to see in a second, the whole information security conversation becomes pushed a little bit more further into the endpoint or the end user's role. Okay. Together with this, there's some financial constraints. For instance, a report by McKinsey has identified that 70% of security executives during the peak of the pandemic thought that their information security budget would shrink in 2021, because obviously there's financial constraints the companies have to face. There's a need to cut costs, and information security budgets get affected by that. So it is actually a very, very tricky landscape that actually leads to new kind of perceptions, I would say, and dynamics around information security. As I said before, more and more, especially after this kind of surge in working from remote, more and more we hear the concept that information security is everyone's business. It's not just IT departments, now it's every employee. It's not just employees training information security, now it's also employees not training information security that have to know about information security. And it's not just cybersecurity at the workplace or having safe security practices at the workplace. All of a sudden it becomes important to obviously also have safe security practices at home. Okay, there's a lot of conversation around what is the right balance between insourcing and outsourcing, and generally speaking, we see that managed security services, or in general outsourcing parts of your security departments, it's growing. The spend in that area is growing. That's probably also associated with kind of the idea of building a little bit more operational expenditure and reducing your capital expenditure, but that's something that is a little bit disconnected from the COVID situation. And obviously there's more push into looking at cybersecurity as a managerial, human, and social problem, and not just a technical. Okay, now I'm not going to go through all of this. One last point that I wanted to emphasize, which is the real dilemma, is then how do you conceive cybersecurity as an enabler of innovation when it feels like it's really not by itself something that produces value for the company in terms of pushing out value to your end users. And this is a little bit the dilemma that a lot of risk management activities face. Okay, if you want to put it in the extreme way, at the end of the day, in risk management, you spend a lot of money, and in the best case scenario, nothing happens. And if you look at that from a business perspective, well, you clearly understand that's probably a bit of a tough call to make in terms of allocating budget to risk management. And obviously, cybersecurity management and cybersecurity risks fall under this umbrella. So we keep hearing about the concept that cybersecurity is an enabler of innovation, but how does that speak to your end users? How does that talk to employees that at their workstation need to get their stuff done from home or from the office, doesn't really matter, and don't really want the friction that sometimes security creates. So here is where in my presentation, and this is the last part, I'm going back into looking into user centricity and understanding what does cybersecurity mean for the employee that every morning goes to work and does their job, and how can that become an enabler for innovation. And I'm just going to conclude my presentation with a quick overview of a project that I recently ran. There was actually a project intended to test if there is a trade-off between employees' productivity and security controls that we build on those employees. Okay, and as I said, this is where I really try to kind of marry my interest for cybersecurity and design thinking as a method, and understand, is there a way we can design security systems in a way that is a little bit more user-friendly so that users can actually engage with them and not perceive them as something that gets in the way when you need to get stuff done. And so in this very quick project, I worked with a couple of banks over in the UK because I started this project when I was there, and a couple of fintech startups. I was really trying to kind of pick their brain on understanding, do employees feel that there is a dilemma between productivity, and again, think of data sharing arrangements and data-driven innovation, and information security. And if there is, what can we do to help them, get across that trade-off? Now, we started by doing some interviews with people working in banks. And overall, we found that the overall perception is that security runs in the background. Okay, so it doesn't really significantly hamper productivity. And I was coming into this project thinking of how many times I have to update my operating system, or run some software updates that my IT department asks me to run while I walk to work in the morning, and I need to get stuff done, and I don't really have time to kind of update my systems. And again, it was a generalization. We just wanted to test if that was the case. In terms of so that was actually a finding. They sort of said, well, no, it runs in the background, it doesn't really get in the way as much. We also tested the concept, is there a significant difference between the perceptions on information security that front office employees have compared to back office employees? And the hypothesis there was, well, if I work constantly with my clients, I'm probably going to try and do whatever I can to please my clients, okay? And as you can understand, sometimes that could translate into taking some shortcuts from an information security perspective, maybe sharing data or information that maybe I'm not supposed to share, or I'm not supposed to share the way I share them. Whereas the other hypothesis were, well, people that are removed from the clients and work in the back office might not have that urge or that push to please the clients, okay? And we find out that, again, in one of the banks, they said, well, it's not really the case, but, this kind of different perception does make a little bit of sense in that I see where you're coming from that. And they kind of immediately shade that around the training programs that are doing for front office and back office employees. And they say, well, it's actually the same, okay? So we train on information security our front office employees the same as we train our back office employees. And the conclusion was, well, we might need to adjust something because along the lines of those perceptions of information security and taking shortcuts or not, there might be a little bit differences between the two types of employees. So we then run some workshops, and I'm almost done. In those workshops, we kind of try to test the concepts of information security personas. And we kind of, for instance, presented a client advisor working for that bank with specific psychological and individual characteristics, and also some characteristics that are designed by his job description and his tasks, as in facing clients all the time and having this massive pressure to please the clients. And we try to understand, how does this person conceive information security compared, for instance, to an IT manager that doesn't really have those pressures as much, whose bread and butter is actually information security, and that has a totally different perception. Okay? So we kind of presented these, and the feedback we had was like, well, they do make sense. They're a bit too rough and too extreme, so we're probably going to need to kind of better define them a little bit, but they do make sense. And another thing that we tested was the concept of an information security journey map. So as an employee, when I go to the office, from the moment I go to the office, or from the moment I wake up to the moment I go back at night, what are the touch points in my journey with information security? I don't know, I turn on my laptop, my corporate laptop at home, and I do some work in the morning, then I drive to work, then I check my phone, then I get to work, I swipe my access card, and so on and so forth. And as you can understand, also that impacts the perception that this person, this employee, has vis-a-vis information security. Now, just to conclude, and again, this last part was really the kind of attempt to go back into looking at the more user-centric and data-driven side of things. I just kind of quickly put down some kind of learnings and ways ahead for data management specialists like you. when interacting with the information security side of things, and understanding how can we balance our need to share data in specific ways and our need for security. Okay, so I do believe that data managers can be wonderful allies for information security departments. And for example, helping information security people think of information security as a user experience. So something that can be shaped also with the input of end users can certainly be a great starting point. Then obviously helping information security people build the defensive measures that cater for everyone's digital literacy. Obviously, as I said, we don't have the same understanding of information security tools when we work in our companies. And I believe that data management is a function that can certainly help build a better understanding, build a better and more shared language and lexicon. You guys can be cybersecurity champions because you know about data, you know about the value of data, and I think you can really represent that step toward not just protecting data and information, but also protecting knowledge within the organization, because you're kind of experts in understanding the usage of data that companies can do. Mapping data and information knowledge assets to help protection, and then more simple things such as, for instance, creating synergies with the information security department to identify what value from the data that they collect can go beyond loss prevention. I think, for instance, the amounts of logs of organizational processes that these people churn on a daily basis, and the type of information that you could extract beyond information security risk. And then, live databases of breaches and near misses with root cause analysis to discuss and learn from those events. And again, a mix of background and foreground security, as in, something running in the background, automated with better awareness for employees and end users in how they manage the data they manage on a daily basis. And that is it. So happy to take comments, questions, whatever you have. Thanks for your attention.